Hi everyone, good afternoon. Please take your seats. We are about to begin. Thank you. Gentlemen, please take your seats. We're just about to begin. Thank you. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to present Kevin Rogers, who will speak about his book. It's not the book that is right here, by the way. Kevin, go ahead.
Afternoon. So about 2 years ago, I retired from working at Deutsche Bank, and the press department thought it would be a good idea to put out a statement about why I was doing it, mainly because the previous day, when the news was leaked, the stock price, Deutsche Bank stock price, came off and wiped $250 million off the market cap, not because of the market's assessment of my brilliance, but probably because they thought something terrible had happened. And so they put out a statement. Now, the statement said that I was going to dedicate my time to musical and academic pursuits, which my colleagues at the time, although they knew there was nothing terrible about what had happened, thought was total bullshit, and that I would end up at some hedge fund. But I was true to my word. And actually, that is what I have been doing, singing, and I attended the LSE to do a master's in economic history, which a little bit more later I'll touch on that, and to write a book. And the book is called Why Aren't They Shouting? And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So on one level, it's a kind of autobiographical account of my career in mainly foreign exchange, a bit in commodities, which I'm sure would guarantee sales of 2 to my mum, maybe my wife. But on another level, and sort of more interesting level, it's an explanation of, analysis of, and kind of polemic about the role of computers in the progression of banking over the last 25 years or so. And that's really what I want to talk about. And mainly, the kind of responses I've got since the book was published in July from regulators, from readers, from people within the industry, my ex-colleagues, journalists, etc. And mainly I'm going to concentrate on the things that I thought were wrong about the book and my responses to them. And why should that be of interest to you? Because I think the central argument of the book and the arguments around that central argument are kind of absolutely key to the way that finance has developed in the past and will develop in the future. And you guys are pretty much central to that process. So what does the book say? Well, primarily, if I can get this to work, the central idea is that ultimately banks are just people and computers. All the rest of it is sort of nice to have, but inessential. And maybe in your own life, you think about all the money that you earn, that you save and you spend. Most of it isn't physical. Most of it's just numbers on some computer somewhere. So if you own wealth that isn't physical property, most of it is electrons. Banks are weightless entities. And the key thing about computers is they've just been getting faster and faster and faster. This is a graph from a very famous study from Yale, and it shows the cost, deflated for wage costs, so it's equivalent of labour, for MSOP, so million standard operations per second. And as you can see, it's a straight line, but the y-axis is logarithmic. So the power of computers has been going up for unit cost 55% per annum. And actually, if you extended more recent studies, it'd say the same thing. So 55% sounds pretty impressive. But what that means is in the course of my career, which is 24 years, that's 40,000 times more powerful per unit of cost computers have got. And that is carrying on. And the argument of the book is that what that has done has completely destabilized banking. It's destabilized the competitive balance within the banking industry in a variety of ways. And so what I'm going to do for the next 10, 12 minutes is talk through the major sort of stories in the book. One is to do with foreign exchange, which you'll all be kind of familiar with, I guess. And the other is my assessment that developments in computers led to the financial crisis. So first off, the FX industry, and I'll go through this relatively quickly because you're an expert audience. But I'm looking out at the audience, there's probably not that many people who were around in the 90s. Anybody around in the 90s? Not quite a few people around in the 90s. So this is a schematic of how FX used to work. Corporations and funds talking to traders or salespeople on the phone, or clearing their risk via interbank brokers. And everything was manual, everything went via the telephone, and it worked fine. The FX market was a sort of functioning market. It turned over billions and billions of dollars, but then it started to change. So the first way it changed was kind of around about the mid-90s. Very, very quickly, spot brokers were just eradicated. And they were eradicated by the introduction of Reuters Dealer and EBS. The key thing is, why weren't they eradicated 10 years earlier? And the answer is the computers weren't fast enough. When the computers got fast enough, then the ability of technology to automate those jobs was there. And once one company, which is Reuters, had gone ahead with their plans, the banks responded with a similar product. At the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, then the next thing that happened was certain banks, and Deutsche Bank, where I used to work, was in the forefront of this, decided that it would be a decent idea to get rid of voice traders. And so they started to replace the price-making and risk-taking aspects of spot with computer systems. And ARM was the name of Deutsche Bank's one, this automatic risk manager. But others, UBS, some of the American banks also followed suit. And the net result of that was that market share started to go more towards those automated systems. And some banks who were not automating saw their market share dwindle very rapidly. But that wasn't how it ended. Because what happened then, as we're probably all aware, is that some banks used their balance sheets for prime brokerage, and the funds and even corporations started to use algorithmic techniques, and we're talking about recent history now, to get into the market as well. And so what we have right now is an FX market that is pretty much automated in many of its products. All the time, the reason that it happened was the ability, technically, to make the changes. So where are we right now? Well, this is a graph of FX turnover. Actually, for the sharp-eyed among you, will realise that actually been a slight downtick to 2016, the latest BIS survey. But the same picture is true, that there was a huge acceleration around about 2002, 2003, as these automated systems came online. And not only that, not only was there a huge a turnover increase, but market concentration also increased. So back in the mid-90s, the top 5 players had 29% of market share. This according to, am I allowed to say Euromoney in this thing? Probably. According to Euromoney. But in 2010, the top 5 players took 62%, which is a huge increase in concentration. And so what's the end game? Well, we're now in a full-scale arms race. I left it as it was still progressing, but there is no limit, really, regulatory limit, to how fast people can get and what a competitive advantage that will give you. Second, and this is a somewhat controversial statement which I'll come back to, that the system, the FX system for providing liquidity to people who need it, has become more fragile. And there's a couple of examples here, the SMB last January, and a few weeks ago, the cable flash crash. Fragility that I argue would not have been possible 20 years ago. So what are the lessons of this story, according to my book? The first is that the development of technology, or the ability to develop technology, dictated firms' strategy. So once computers became fast enough and the ability to undercut, say, voice brokers or spot traders became available, banks, one bank or the other, was pretty much forced to do the change. And why was this forced? Well, there's what I call the Guns of August idea. Now, the Guns of August is a book by Barbara Tuchman about the outbreak of World War I. And if you don't know about the outbreak of World War I, you know that once one country started mobilizing, everybody else had to start mobilizing, that they feared they'd be cut out and at a disadvantage. And that's exactly what happened in the FX markets. And then the last thing I claim is that the systemic effect, the market concentration, the fragility, wasn't planned at all. Nobody took control of it. It was a natural consequence of the competitive developments that the industry went through. So that's one story, FX. Now, actually, I think the FX story is kind of benign. I mean, there's a lot of good things that came out of automation in foreign exchange. Prices are more transparent, prices are more tighter, top of book. On the other hand, the market's more fragile. The second story is not so benign. So we all remember Lehman Brothers, we all remember 07, 08. But the key thing about the great financial crisis, this is what Ben Bernanke said, is that it wasn't a systemic problem of solvency. That the losses from subprime were not big enough. The wealth effect was not big enough to bring down the banking system in its own right. In fact, a bad day in the equity markets will lose more money than could have been lost on subprime. Instead, as he says here, what it was a systemic fragility, a systemic vulnerability of the banking system. And that's the reason that the crisis was so severe. And what were those vulnerabilities? Well, I argue first, complexity. So the complexity of the actual products that nobody really understood, and the linkages between firms. The second was excessive leverage in the banking system, asset to capital ratios. And the third was size. So the size of institutions, which one, made them incredibly difficult to understand and manage, and two, meant that when they got into trouble, they couldn't just be allowed to fail. The only time they allowed somebody to fail, with Lehman Brothers, it almost brought the entire world economy down. And in each of these systemic vulnerabilities, you can find that computers, or the development of faster computer technology, was behind it. So, very briefly, I'll run through this. Now, I'm a derivatives trader. A couple in the audience I know. So, we all know derivatives need to be priced and risk managed, otherwise you can't trade them. For options, which is the building block of all derivatives, there was no pricing formula for them from their invention in ancient Greece until 1973. So despite the fact they have an economically useful function, they weren't traded heavily. Until 1973, and then Black and Scholes came out with their famous formula to allow options to be priced, and then the market took off. But Black and Scholes is an analytic equation. It's an exact solution for option pricing. But the more complexity needed numerical solutions, and numerical solutions need fast computers. So the amount of complexity you could build in to derivatives was limited by how fast your computers were, because numerical methods like tree methods and lattices needed faster computers. As computers got faster, when pricing was decoupled from the need to make them analytically solvable, more complexity came into the market. Lastly, kind of in the 2000s, Monte Carlo techniques. Monte Carlo is like a massive computational hammer to be able to solve pretty much any pricing problem, were possible because of the advance in computer power. And the key thing about Monte Carlo is it's more efficient if you use it for baskets of lots and lots and lots of assets. It goes up linearly with the number of assets, unlike lattices, which go up with the power. All that is just a complicated way of saying that in the 2000s, the power of computers allowed an explosion in derivative complexity. And so it paved the way to all the complexity that we saw in the markets building up to 07, 08. Leverage. Here's Mr. Haldane, Andrew Haldane. The leverage in the banking system was enormous and unprecedentedly high historical levels, pretty much 40 to 1 on a raw basis. Why? Once again, banks competing with each other to try and get higher return on equities, and comforted by techniques like VAR, like techniques like computational credit risk management, liquidity management, all of which did two things. First, they relied on the future being like the past, and the second thing, they relied on massive computer power. You cannot run VAR for a big bank without lots of very powerful computers. And the ability to do that led to greater leverage. And lastly, size. We'll come back to this in a bit. Here's a graph of the market share of the biggest 10 banks in the US. And you can see that they sort of, for decades, they took about 25, 30%. And then from the 90s onwards, they expanded massively. And partly that, it's all mainly through mergers. Partly that's because the regulations changed, but also partly it's because the economics of running a bank changed dramatically because of advanced communications and more powerful computers. So we have a situation which I describe in the book as the risk perception gap. So computers did two different and dangerously contradictory things. The first thing is they made the system more fragile. So they made the products more complicated as firms competed to try and get into, maintain margins, encourage excessive leverage, etc. But on the other hand, because of scientific risk management, the ability to communicate globally, and a sort of technical mindset within banks, they gave management of banks the illusion of control. We all thought, I say we, that we knew what we were doing and we were under control. And the analogy really is driving a very powerful vehicle that you can't see out of the windows. All you can do is fly by instruments. And you put the foot down on the accelerator and the instruments say you're going from 30 to 35, but in reality you're going from 30 to 100. That's what happened to the banking system. And this perception gap I class as being behind the problem. So what's happened post-crisis? Well, we had a regulatory blitz, sort of shock and awe, attempt to reduce leverage, attempt to reduce complexity, CCPs, Dodd-Frank, MiFID, the rest of it. An attempt by banks to try to simplify. There is virtually no bank out there, I don't think, that is sort of taking on extra business units. There's not, mergers have stopped. People are trying to shed peripheral businesses. But what that's doing is opening up opportunities for disruptive entrants. So new technology players are able to come in and attack the most vulnerable parts of banking value chains because now they have access to better technology. So, here's a few examples, and I'm sure, quite a lot of the discussions today have been around these. So, payments technology, but 43, according to McKinsey, 43% of all banks' end P&L comes effectively from payments. Blockchain techniques will, if their proponents are to be believed, disintermediate banks. High-frequency market making. The problem with banks doing this stuff is, they just have a huge amount of legacy systems on in the building, and newer, smarter entrants have more access to better technology. The sales function will probably start being automated as well as the trading function. And my own personal bête noire, the massive increase in intra-bank surveillance. So the end of the book is sort of says that, you know, kind of computers and competition created this sort of fragile banking system. Well, could start to eat it from the inside. And there's a potential for that to come up with a new market structure that might be better for all of us. So that's the book. What have people said about it? Well, I'd like to stand here for 15 minutes and just say the nice things, because actually most people have said nice things about it. But that would be a bit tedious and not very instructive. So I'm going to talk about the criticisms. The first one I got, and this is from people who are not in the industry, why is everybody in the book so nice? And they said, well, you know, kind of, aren't bankers and finance people all arseholes? You know, kind of, why is it that the book makes people out to be kind of okay? And I said, well, that's because, in my experience, the people that I work with were kind of okay. And I think probably for most of you in the audience, you know, and that points to a fundamental problem, I think, with people trying to understand banking and trying to understand the banking crisis, which there is a kind of accepted story about how it happened. If you don't know much about art, this is William Blake's Number of the Beast. That's you lot. So the accepted story of the crisis is pretty much this, that there was incompetence, stupidity, greed, carelessness. There's 100 books that say stuff like this. The problem, from my perspective, is I just don't believe it, and it doesn't comport to my recollection, and I can't believe that there was a massive uptick of stupidity and greed, specifically from 2000 to 2007. It just seems kind of fairly unlikely. So the book is an attempt to try to explain why a system can go so badly wrong if the people within it are trying to do the right thing. And actually, I toyed with making this the title of the book, but apparently there's a fiction book with a similar title, so I wasn't allowed. So this brings me on really to the probably the central and most difficult to defend criticism of the book that I've seen from academics, from industry practitioners, and from regulators, is that my view of this, you know, the story of how banking went wrong is too mechanistic. There's no room for human agency. Humans were you know, not involved. A friend of mine said, oh, so it's all the computer's fault. Nobody, you know, there was no human greed or malpractice. That isn't what I'm saying at all. It really isn't. And the first thing to say is computers don't program themselves. Ultimately, if the market went wrong because of computational power, it's because of human decisions to use technology in a way that ultimately got us to where we are. So I'm not, you know, shifting the blame. The computers don't think for themselves. And the fundamental thing I'm claiming is that although individual managers in individual banks had choices about what they could do, systemically, technology determined the outcome. This is a viewpoint called technological determinism, which some people hate. So let me give an example. In the idea of automating spot, well, Deutsche Bank was one of the people who went with it, but it could easily be somebody else. And whoever went first would have dragged everybody else with it. Barclays were the people who came up with decimalisation. It could have been another bank. But once it becomes possible to do these things, then eventually, my claim is, it will happen. So my model of kind of how markets and banks and finance changes is that there's two basic keys, like a nuclear weapon. You've got the technology base and how that develops, and then you've got regulations, a kind of arena in which all this happens. And those two things together, coupled with competitive pressures, determine the outcome. And you can see that, I think, in the build-up to 07, 08. The other thing you can do is see it in the historical record. And I said I'd done a master's in economic history and just graduated, actually. And one of the things I looked at was the 19th century English banking industry. This is my dissertation. The key thing about the 19th century English banking industry is there was a huge increase in concentration in 30 years. In 1890, there were 528 banks in England. By 1920, there were 18. The top 5 banks had 20% market share in 1890, 86% in 1920. And those of us who live in Britain will recognise the names of those 5 banks because they're still around today. And there's no adequate explanation. Like everybody says, oh, it's about cost, it's about economies of scale. Well, it isn't, actually. If you look at the records of banks, their cost-income ratios rose. Oh, it's all about market power. Well, if it's about market power, why couldn't they go and coagulate and concentrate earlier? Because there was no regulatory impediment for them doing that. Actually, what it turns out, and this is a graph from my dissertation, funnily enough, the blue line is the distance between mergers. And there's a lot of theory to say that's very conditioned by communication speed. And the red line is a modelled line based on the extent of the telegraph and railway system, and particularly telephones. What happened in the 19th century, I claim, is that a new technology arrived within a regulatory environment that was completely laissez-faire, and that allowed banks to concentrate, to centralise, and to control bigger and bigger banks with a wider and wider spread of geography. The same thing, and we've seen this graph before, kind of happened in American banking, where regulatory easing and computers, the 2 keys on the sort of nuclear weapon, both happened simultaneously, and we saw a huge increase in size. So this idea of the sort of linkage between regulation, technology, and the competitive pressures moving a banking system in a certain way, certainly more than a century old. Now I'm getting on to the minor criticisms. That mechanistic thing, I think, is dead important, because actually that talks to how markets will develop in the future. Now, I've had some quibbles. I was doing a presentation at the Belgian embassy a few weeks ago, prior to October 7th, and one chap said, oh, well, I don't really believe that the FX markets have got more fragile. You know, you put in your book about the SNB, and that was a special case, and blah, blah, blah. Well, I said, you know, kind of, if you think that was the market working brilliantly, I don't think it was. But, you know, we can agree to disagree. But that was obviously before October the 7th. And we got the cable flash crash. And now, I would argue that if you get a multiple standard deviation move coming from nowhere in one of the biggest currency pairs on Earth, this is the 1st and 5th biggest economy on Earth, 10% of all flows are cable, and there's no easy explanation, that should be supremely worrying if you do foreign exchange. And I also claim that it would not have been possible in the pre-computerized market. Somebody somewhere would have come in and bought pounds. Another criticism, I'm unfair to regulators in the book. And that's, funnily enough, comes from regulators. They say, oh, well, you know, kind of, we sort of did our best. Well, I sort of beg to differ. I think one thing I would say, and I do acknowledge in the book, is that sort of regulators are subject to competition too. That, you know, it's not a level playing field. And it's pretty clear, actually, from the way that regulation went, and you know, light touch in the US, in the UK, and following on from the US, that there was a competition for business, and regulation was loosened in order to bring business to various national centres. Now, since 2008, we've had an attempt to kind of right the wrongs that we saw prior to the crisis. I'm out of the markets now. I'm not entirely convinced that they're working or can work. I suggested a couple of little things in the books to make things better. One was actually have regulators situated in banks, not to kind of enforce anything, but just to observe what's happening. One of the things I think is worrying about the way finance is regulated, the regulators don't have a very clear understanding about what is going on. And I think if they'd been running around, going to meetings with people designing CDOs, they should have been worried at that point. The other thing, which is, and everybody hates this idea, both sort of from left-wing people and right-wing people, is the idea that instead of having an implicit option where governments will backstop their national banks, they should actually just write the equity option and just make it a real thing that banks pay premium for. Actually, I love that option. I love that because that option really exists. If you don't think so, think of all the talk about Deutsche Bank and whether the German state would back them up. The option's there. The problem is we don't know when and if it's going to be exercised. And then a last couple of things. I'm pretty hard on rational markets. If you're brought up in the sort of business school tradition, this was a religion, and it's clearly failed. It's clearly failed. And if you can read one, if you have the patience to read one book of economics, read Hyman Minsky's book, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. He is a sort of fringe economist, less fringe now that he's proved to be right, who basically says that banking systems in advanced capitalist economies are endogenously, intrinsically unstable, that they will, all of their own, have bubbles and crashes, whereas the kind of rational markets theory says that can't happen. And lastly, this is up for you guys, I'm very, very kind of optimistic at the end, well, not very optimistic, but optimistic at the end of the book, to say that actually new competitors and new regulations around those competitors can save the banking industry, mainly by making it more decentralized and less subject to the fragility that we saw prior to 07-08. And that's no longer my responsibility, but basically the people who are still in the market, that's yours. There we have it. That's me done. I'll open it up for questions if you'd like to. Otherwise, I'll get off and let you drink.
Just one, because we're
fine.
One lucky.
Fine. So, yeah.
You say that sort of the driving of technology, the driving of technology has driven consolidation in banks, and that happened after 1920. I'm assuming you think that post 1920 it was the World War that saw that back again.
No, actually, what happened was that I mentioned that there's a combination of technology and regulation. The regulation in English banking was non-existent. You could pretty much do whatever you bloody well wanted to. You buy who you wanted to. And then they freaked out kind of around about 1917 and then put a commission into place to approve all mergers. And so effectively at that point it stopped. So at that point the regulation tightened and concentrated, because I thought people were worried there'd just be one bank in England, basically. But yeah, that was a combination of regulation and technology-led regulation followed.